I'm going to pretend like it's already noon and start with good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Bill Kopsky. I'm at the Arkansas Citizens First Congress and the Arkansas Public Policy Panel. I'm here with several partners, and we're going to tell you today about our concerns about the governor's education reform bill, SB294. Today, I think most of our organizations have submitted comments to the legislature, or we're going to be tomorrow in committee, about some of our concerns. When we were in the Senate last week, Senator Hammer suggested that organizations submit written comments if they didn't find the 5 minutes allowed to testify on the 144-page bill that at that time we'd had for about 40 hours. So we took them up on that and sent written comments, which I think you all have a copy of today. So there's a couple of kind of big points that I want to highlight before turning it over to our other partners. First of all, this bill is being sold as a public education bill about literacy. And that's not the way that we read the bill. We read the bill as actually having not very much to do with public education other than dismantling an awful lot of it and privatizing it in the form of vouchers and a massive expansion of charter schools that we've not talked enough about. And the only provisions around literacy, the bill's also been sold as a literacy bill. And our poor performance on literacy has been touted as a key reason for this bill. But there's kind of two main components of literacy in the bill, and they're both only partially funded, while other parts that have no evidence behind them that they will help, and actually an awful lot of evidence that they would hurt, are fully funded, such as vouchers and, again, the expansion of charter schools. So we find that really concerning. We think what this bill really is a school privatization bill, and we should just call it that. And we should peel out the parts around public education and run a separate school public education, improving public education bill. The part about privatization that's not been talked enough about is the charter expansion. In the bill is a provision that is coerce, encourage, really push schools that are rated D and F into entering into contracts with for-profit companies or private charter operators. And there's a couple of things about this. This is over 300 schools in the state that currently are ranked as a D or an F, a third of our public schools. Why do we have so many schools that rank D and F? Because our grading system is terrible. It's really an indicator of poverty, where Arkansas is #1 in the nation. So being #1 in the nation does not surprise that we have an awful lot of schools that are ranked a D and F, because it's really an indicator, the largest indicator of a student's performance in school by far is family income. So there's zero evidence that these kinds of contracts with private outside entities boost student performance. Yet the state is making a massive bet on it, and within the first year, up to 300 schools could be privatized under the plain language of the bill, which we find frightening and unhelpful. The other thing that we've really focused on in our comments is that we have no idea about the long-term costs of the voucher scheme parts of this bill in particular. There's sort of two core components. So one is a voucher tax credit that, as the bill is written, really becomes a permanent entitlement program that increases automatically by 5% every year after the limits hit. So it starts at $6 million, up to $6 million, and 100% refundable tax credits for giving money to a nonprofit voucher scheme. Now, I represent a nonprofit. I think it would be lovely if nonprofits had 100% tax credits and we could all direct our tax dollars wherever, to whichever causes we all find the most helpful. But that's not the way that most society works, and it's not the way the government works. But in this program, not only is it created with a $6 million floor, but it grows by 5% every year. So out by year 20, it's going to get $20 million, and the legislature has no long-term cost projections of this to consider before approving it. The other key expensive element in here is that voucher program. So they start with a 1.5% of the state's student population being able to go, and then it phases up to 3%. But really, after year 2, there's no limit. And so currently in Arkansas, there are over 44,000 students in private schools and homeschools right now. And so if they all applied for the voucher program, in year 3, it would cost the state over $300 million to implement that. And the bill is completely silent about about how they would fund that, where the new cap might be. Again, the legislature is signing on to a 30-year mortgage is the way I've been talking about it, and we ought to know what the balloon payments at year 3 and 5 and 10 are. There's a lot of other things in the bill that we have challenges with, particularly what's not in the bill, but I'm going to turn it over to our partners to share some of those concerns. So I think Olivia Gardner from Advocates for Children and Families.
Hi, my name is Olivia Gardner. I'm the Education Policy Director with Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. We're an organization that's been advocating for Arkansas children since 1977. As you might have heard from other groups, there are components of this bill that I'm not necessarily opposed to. However, combining all of these policy changes into one omnibus and rushing this legislation through so quickly makes it seem as though there's an effort to limit debate on perhaps the most sweeping overhaul of our state's education system in recent memory. This bill will create, as you've heard, an unlimited voucher program that will undoubtedly drain resources away from our public schools over time, and it will allow families to use state dollars for homeschooling their children without a substantial amount of accountability or defined standards. And it will effectively create a tiered system of education in our state with those who have access to private school on one side, and on the other side, either those who cannot afford it, even with the Education Freedom Fund, Education Freedom Account funds, those who have children with disabilities, and those who live in rural areas for whom school choice is not an option. Additionally, my work also focuses on early childhood education, and I believe that this bill does not go far enough to address the crisis facing our state in early childhood education. There is no money in this bill for increasing access and affordability for early childhood education. There is nothing in this bill that supports our early childhood education workforce, and this bill merely streamlines the system and kicks the can down the road. And waiting to adequately fund our early learning system until the next legislative session will simply be too late. The vast majority of children in Arkansas, over 90%, attend public schools, and Arkansas taxpayer dollars for education should be invested exclusively in public education so that every child in every Arkansas community has the opportunity to experience a world-class education, and that starts from birth. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm Tom Masseau. I'm the Director of Disability Rights Arkansas. Our mission is to advocate and enforce the legal rights of all persons with disabilities here in the state. One of our main visions is that we envision a state where everybody is involved. Everybody is an equal partner in their community, whether it's a school, employment, recreation, church, wherever it may be. We also receive hundreds of calls from families who are trying to access the special education system across the state, both in the public school as well as charter schools. Many times, families are not receiving the appropriate special education services at their charter schools, so they return back to the public schools. We agree at Disability Rights Arkansas that we need a strong education system to provide all Arkansans as they leave high school to pursue their hopes and dreams. However, in reviewing the LEARNS bill proposed by Governor Sanders and Senator Davis last week, those opportunities are not provided to students with disabilities. In 2019, there were over 63,000 or 13.4% of students with disabilities receiving special education services here in the state. That's an increase of 18% since 2013. But where in this bill do you see those needs being addressed for students with disabilities? We did not see it in this bill. Some of our concerns include the lack of training for mental health, training requirements for school resource officers, the overall lack of training even there, the threat assessments that's proposed focuses on responding and reacting to threats after a student is experiencing a crisis. There's nothing about talking about what supports that student needs, and oftentimes what we see is that leads to a push-out or suspension or expulsion for students with disabilities. Transportation is a huge issue. We know that some charter and private schools do not provide transportation for their students. This is an inequity for all students who want to participate. Even with the grant program that's proposed in this bill, it doesn't go far enough. We know that to provide accessible transportation for a student with disability costs a lot. It does reference rideshare programs, But how many Ubers and Lyfts and others have you seen that are accessible or have van lifts in them, especially in the rural areas? So there it does not exist, and I think the transportation funding allocated this doesn't go far enough. Voucher bills, we all talked about the voucher component, but let's be honest. This is an educational fund for families who send their children to private schools or subsidize for them. That's what this is all about here. We know that private schools don't have to adhere to the federally mandated Individualized Disability Education Act, or IDEA. So for many families whose child has a disability, they must determine if they want to place their child in a school without the supports they need, or keep them in a school with little or no supports. That is not choice. This is a serious issue that's not addressed in this bill. This past week, we've heard from Senator Davis and the governor that this bill should not be a surprise to anyone because they've been working on it for many months and years. But all we have seen so far is a colorful chart of a diagram and talking points. There were no details as to the impact this reform would have on students with disabilities, and we are not aware of any conversations with stakeholders in the disability community. If we're going to truly reform the educational system, let's take time to drill down and get a real idea of what is working and what is not. Let's look at the funding for special education, the oversight from schools, the discrepancies that exist between funding athletic programs and teaching students with disabilities, the lack of oversight on special education rules from the Department of Education. These are all uncomfortable conversations to have, but they are relevant if we're truly interested in ensuring that making education is a priority for all. So we have the following questions to the governor and Senator Davis. Who will hold charter and private schools accountable for providing special education services under IDEA? How will public schools leave a transformational campus? Why is behavioral health training only required once every 5 years? Who will assess the private schools for testing? Will private schools provide all requirements under IDEA for students with disabilities? Will charter and private schools provide accessible transportation? Are all private schools accessible to people with disabilities? If not, will they be required to become accessible? And how many, this is the important one, is how many people with disabilities or disability organizations were involved in the development of this plan? Or was the disability community an afterthought? Over the last year, stakeholders from the disability community came together and adopted a disability policy platform, asking the state to commit to creating policies that address the areas of concern. In education, we're asking the legislature to provide safe, comprehensive, inclusive education for every student. Unfortunately, the LEARNS Act largely ignores the needs of children with disabilities and their families once again. This falls short of the governor's expectations of ensuring every child has access to a quality education. Once again, the needs of the disability community are ignored. We want a state where all are welcome and have the same opportunities, as well as not creating a state of class systems for education. Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
Oh my goodness. So as a parent of a child who has special needs and went through Arkansas public school systems, thank you. Because those are the same issues that I raised with my child going through our public school systems. And as an educator and as the president of the Arkansas Education Association, I too have those same questions. So I am Carol Fleming. I am the president of the Arkansas Speech Language, oh my goodness.
It's been a long week.
Yeah.
You've been
It
up
has,
on
oh my
Bill.
gosh, yeah, so I am Carol Fleming. I am a speech language pathologist, and I am president of the Arkansas Education Association, the professional organization that has been representing public school educators since 1869. We were actually started by the first superintendent of public instruction in the state of Arkansas, so that would be our Department of Education. And we were founded so that we could advocate for educators and for students, not only for working conditions, but for the perception of the community as to the profession of public school educators, as well as for salaries and for professional development. And it's really strange that in 1869, those were the things that we were advocating for. And here we are in 2023, still advocating for those very same issues. The Arkansas Education Association, we do agree with some of the items that have been outlined in the LEARNS Act. But one of the main concerns for us is that the voice of educators has not been included in the development of this act. And it's really telling that today we begin Public School Education Week in this, nationwide. And here we are talking about this very issue. On Thursday, that is Read Across America Day. That's when everyone celebrates the birth of Dr. Seuss. We go into the classrooms, we're reading, we're promoting literacy. And again, these are things that we as educators hold dear and true to ourselves, but yet our voice was not included as part of the development of this. It was asked of me, did the Arkansas Education Association reach out to the governor knowing that this was one of her key components as she was going through the state of Arkansas campaigning? Yes, we did. And last week I inaccurately referred to the individual as Christian. His name was Chris. And we had spoken numerous times on the telephone and through text messages with Chris, who told us that the governor really wanted to meet with us and get our opinion on moving education forward in the state of Arkansas. We have yet to have heard from the governor. We are in the scheduling queue. I get the same rote email saying, thank you for your email. There's no availability at this time. We have you in the scheduling queue, and when a meeting becomes available, we will let you know. We've been doing this since August, and here we are still in the scheduling queue. Senator Davis herself asked, or actually Senator Hammer asked me if I had reached out to Senator Davis. Now we all know we did not know who the lead sponsors were on this legislation until essentially the 11th hour. It was literally right before it was being dropped. And that's because every time any of us and anyone in the public asked questions regarding the legislation, we were told the governor is keeping it very close. There is a small group of individuals who are working with her, and we don't even know what is in that legislation. And that was coming from senior legislators who then stood behind the governor when she had her press conference on, I believe, February 8th or February 9th. And then still no one knew what was actually contained within that bill. We had an infographic, but we did not have details. The devil is in the details, and until you actually see the details, you don't know. An infographic does not tell you specifically. So I have since last week's Senate committee meeting, I have sent an email to Senator Davis, but I received an auto reply. And at the committee meeting, she said, yes, she was interested in working with us, but I have received an auto reply telling me that she is very busy, she gets an awful lot of emails, and that she will get around to the email when she has time. I have not heard from her. So I will be reaching out to her again, and I also this morning reached out to her this morning and to Representative Brooks, because there has been an amendment that has been filed. And if you were present at the Senate Ed Committee meeting, you heard Senator Hammer ask Senator Davis, if we're going to send this to the House and if we're going to pass this, we need your commitment that you are going to make these amendments. These amendments have to be made in order to clean up this bill. And he had some very specific things that he requested. One was on the age of the children who were receiving sex education. There was also regarding the impact of the Arkansas teacher retirement system. He also asked about teacher fair dismissal, and I think there was one other, and I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Standards.
Yes, I'm sorry, you're right. And it was the accountability for the private schools and the charter schools. We've seen the amendments. They were They were submitted late Friday night, and we've all had a chance to look at them. A lot of it is more just cleanup language, making technical corrections. There is not anything still to special education and support staff. And she was specifically asked about salaries for our support staff. And she said that it would be addressed in the adequacy funding. Well, as an educator and as a special educator, I know that if it's not written, it one, did not happen, and two, you're not going to have to be accountable to it. And it still is not written, and it still is not there, which means for someone to tell us that the intent is that the superintendents and the principals will ensure due process and will ensure that the salary schedules are developed for certified and classified staff. Intent is all well and good, but if it's not written, they don't have to be held accountable to it. And this is about accountability, transparency, collaboration. Why do we have to push a bill through so quickly that has taken, as we've been told, 2 years to develop? So you've had 2 years to develop something that you want to push through with less than a week's time to the public. And the public needs to be involved. We have to hear the voice of our parents, our students, and our educators. All need to be involved. And when we're talking about all, we mean all, not some. And this bill is not representative of all in the state of Arkansas. It's only representative of some. And I think with that,
We're happy to take some questions.
I may have addressed everything. Happy to take questions.
So it was mentioned in the press release that this bill is not evidence-based. Can you kind of further elaborate on that it's not evidence-based?
Yes.
So there are, among the academic research on what improves student outcomes, there are certain things that there's broad consensus on that evidence supports. Preschool, after-school and summer programs, wraparound services for low-income kids because poverty is the #1 driver of low student performance. Where there is no evidence are vouchers, charter schools, merit pay that this bill makes a heavy bet on. There's just simply no evidence in the literature. Now the other side will say, well, we have a study that says that vouchers are good in this state. Look at those studies. They haven't been peer reviewed and they've been paid for by an entity supported by a privatization foundation like the Walton Fund. In terms of academic peer reviewed research, there is no evidence that vouchers benefit students, that charter schools benefit students, and in fact there's good evidence that they in some cases hurt. There's a recent study looking at both Arizona and Indiana's charter school experiments that shows they actually hurt student performance. Not only that, there's an opportunity cost that we lose when we spend $100 million on an unproven strategy like vouchers that are going to hurt. That's $100 million that we're not spending on pre-K or after school and summer programs where we know we could benefit. So when's the last time pre-K had a funding increase?
It's been over a decade.
And the state put $0 into after school and summer programs. Those are two evidence-based, proven solutions to boost student learning that this bill is silent on.
Well, and the other thing with pre-K is that there is the intent to increase access to pre-K, but will all children actually have that access? Because many of our children, particularly those that are in the rural areas, they're not going to be able to have transportation in order to access pre-K intervention, and that is something to also consider. It's important to note that what we have in every zip code in the state of Arkansas is a public school. What we don't have in every zip code is a school where a child can use a voucher. That's not what we have.
Other questions?
You spoke a little bit about how this bill could create a financial divide as well as an ability divide among families and students. Can you speak a little bit more about that and how this could create that?
There's two, you want to go first?
Well, so you have to consider that our rural school districts are really going to be impacted by this. We've already heard from superintendents who have told us that raising the salaries to $50,000 as the starting base pay for their employees is going to have them look at their employee base, and they're going to have to put hiring freezes into place. They're going to have reduction in force, which means that they're going to have to increase class sizes. So we're not going to have smaller class sizes with more one-to-one intervention, which we know is how our students actually learn the best and how they are best supported. And so that's one of the concerns, as well as the vouchers themselves do not fully fund these private school tuitions. I mean, if you're going to receive $7,500 or $8,000 and you have a tuition of $13,000 for kindergarten through grade 3, then that's not paying the entire amount. Plus then you're also putting your children in a school that is not being held accountable. We do not know what those accountability measures are going to be. And then there are waivers to, well, you actually are not required to have a certified classroom teacher, someone with a teaching license to provide the instruction or provide special education services. The only service that is required is that of a speech language pathologist. And if you live in one county and you attend a private school in another area, your home district area is going to be the one providing those speech language pathology services in that private school, which means that that is an additional expense on the local school district to provide those services.
There's four other places, or four other ways that this bill expands inequity between high-income school districts and low-income school districts. The salary schedule being eliminated means that high-income districts are going to be able to offer teacher salaries and bonuses higher than the minimum. But in low-wealth districts where they're already completely strapped, they're simply not going to be able to. So we're going to see the teacher salary schedule disparity between high-wealth districts and low-wealth districts widen. So low-income districts are not going to be able to get the experienced, highly qualified teachers, frankly, where they are needed the most in the state. Furthermore, the maternity leave program, where we fully support it and actually think it should just be family leave, the fact that it is requires a match and is optional, again, means high wealth districts will be able to do it, frankly many are, and low wealth districts won't be able to do it. So again, opening up a disparity gap between who can recruit and retain highly qualified, highly experienced teachers and who can't. There are several programs in the bill that require competitive grants, which means your school district has a grant writer and can afford the match that those grants require. So again, even in services, this bill widens the gap between low wealth districts and high wealth districts. And the last way that this bill expands inequity is there is the word shall over 400 and some odd times in the bill. A lot of those shalls are all mandates and most of them are not funded. And so there's a lot of new unfunded mandates that are going to stretch, again, lower wealth school districts even further to comply with.
And over the summer, we saw a lot of work in the legislature on school safety. We saw recommendations come out from the School Safety Committee, and a lot of that focused on mental health training and SRO training. But I know you mentioned that you don't think there is enough of that in this bill. Do you think that's addressed?
No, it's not addressed in here. I think, because the training for an SRO to look at threats or to look at, they're not mental health therapists. I mean, they're not professional. And so how do we expect them to determine whether or not somebody's in a crisis and how to deal with that crisis? And when you're taking away training requirements once every 5 years, how is that helpful to the student? How is that helpful to the school? So I think there needs to be a further conversation looking at how can we ensure that if a student is going through a crisis or poses a threat, how do we handle that in a way that doesn't automatically take down the kid or expels them or pushes them out, suspends them? We need to really take that approach and really try to figure out what it is. And to your question on the equity piece and developing the class, I think it goes beyond that also for families. We're creating a class of families here. I mean, from the disability perspective, from our conversations with parents and what we see is families are struggling trying to make ends meet with their student who has a disability for transportation, home aids, all of those components. And then you give them a voucher and say, hey, look, you can go to a private school, you can go wherever you want. How do they balance that? How do they judge? How do they handle that? Because first they're trying to find transportation for themselves. And if nowadays, if a student, experiences a crisis, they're going to get a call and they're going to have to go pick the student up. If they're in a private school, charter school, how is that all going to happen? Those are things that we haven't talked about. So our concern is that you're going to be creating a class of systems. You're going to have those who can attend the private schools and the charter schools and afford it, and those who don't have the means to do so. You're going to have those. You're creating a segregated setting here. And that is something that we oppose because we really truly believe that everybody should be given the same opportunities regardless.
So there's a lot of components, a lot of things that go into this bill. Simply put, what do you want to happen with this bill?
So, yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to pause and slow down and really look at the consequences of this bill. If we really want to have a truly reformed education system, what's the harm to bring everybody involved to the table and have a conversation, an honest conversation? Again, those conversations are difficult to have because not everybody's going to agree, but we need to slow the process down and bring everybody to the table. Look at all the other major reforms that have been enacted over the years. They weren't done in a 40-hour timeline or in a week and a half, though they brought stakeholders to the table. This misses the point big time.
This is a school privatization bill and not a public education reform bill. The last time we had a major public education reform effort in Arkansas, it was wildly successful. It was the Blue Ribbon Commission that met after Lakeview, commissioned by Governor Huckabee. It brought diverse stakeholders from all parts of the state together. They held public hearings for over 2 years. They looked at evidence-based solutions. They brought in experts to testify. They went around the state and held other public engagements with parents and teachers around the state. That's how you build a world-class education system. And the result of the Blue Ribbon Commission was between 2003 and 2015, Arkansas had the fastest improving education system in the country according to NAEP scores. After 2015, we started prioritizing tax cuts instead of those research-proven reforms, and we started providing waivers through the form of vouchers, and those NAEP scores flattened off and started declining again. So we know how to do this. The governor's just choosing to not follow the path.
You feel like she's trying to do your job for you by obviously not answering emails and, whoever she's consulting with to write this?
I'm not sure whose job she's doing, but it's certainly not mine.
Going off some of the things that I asked earlier about kind of strategy, do you hope to eventually defeat the bill because of the voucher provision, or are you hoping to improve it in your eyes, to add things in, knowing that it's likely to pass, there's enough co-sponsors already on the bill to pass the bill? So are you hoping to just improve the bill, or do you ultimately, with the voucher thing in it, and it's not likely to ever be taken out, to defeat the bill?
The bill can be improved dramatically by evening the standards that private schools accepting vouchers, charter schools, and public schools have to follow. All of those shalls are different for those three entities. So private schools shall do this with your public tax dollars, charter schools shall do that, and public schools should do all of it. So that's completely unfair. So we're hoping that in our comments, we make several suggestions on amendments that would make a bad bill better. But the truth of the matter is that this bill will fail. It will not improve our education system. So even if it passes, we're going to be back at it in 2 years, having to start again. How do we improve our education system so it serves all of our kids?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are components of this legislation that I will simply never agree with. But I do think even with that, there are improvements that we can make to make this more palatable for folks and to make it and to ensure that this is less harmful to Arkansas's children.
Accountability and transparency would be good starting places.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think we all agree on that.
I mean, I'll give you one more example. Arkansas is 10 years into a pretty heavy experiment on charter schools. Before we take all the limits off them, why don't we have the Bureau of Legislative Research and the Department of Education do an analysis of what's the impact of those charter schools been over 10 years, and engage some stakeholders and look and actually evaluate what we've already done before jumping off of the cliff and taking all the guardrails off of just the charter school component of the bill. So there's a lot of ways to chart a path forward that this bill is trying to blow by.
Yeah, sorry, I have one more thing to add. I would also say that, you know, this bill, it would have been great initially if we'd had multiple bills to look at and read from. If we'd had a voucher bill to talk about, if we'd had a teacher pay bill to talk about, if we had, you know, if it had been broken up into separate pieces of legislation, I think that would have made it a lot more possible for folks like us to have our input and to explain to the public why particular pieces of legislation need improvement. But being all lumped together really puts us in a tricky situation and makes it so that folks in our state legislature will be, you know, sort of forced to vote for this legislation, even though there are pieces they may disagree with.
Because it's all or none.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And it's been so rushed. You know, like we made a good faith effort in suggesting amendments, but we really honestly just finished understanding the bill last night, the day before. And you know, I know there's, again, like there are so many unfunded mandates in here that people don't even know about yet, because it takes a while to digest some of this. It's 144 pages of legalese, and there's a lot here that's not gonna, I can't tell you how many times as a state board ordered to create new rules. I mean,
Right.
the rulemaking is going to take years that this bill mandates. I mean, it's bureaucracy going to explode.
As well as with the grant proposals that are mentioned throughout the bill. I mean, grants, you cannot build a budget around a grant. And we have school districts that are being asked to build their budget and their funding moving forward based on grants. And those are usually with a time constraint. And so that in and of itself is also a concern. But then again, we have a 2-year fiscal impact statement, but what about after 2 years? So have they even looked to see what that impact is going to be after 2 years? Because as Bill mentioned, we're going to be back here again in 2 years discussing this.
We put a couple graphs in our comments, which you have, that show some possible projections on growth, but we are not the Department of Finance and Authority. So we did some good faith estimates, but it would be better if the state did their own.
What's the worst case scenario for this bill rollout?
I don't know if
I think the worst case scenario for students receiving special education services is what's next. You know, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences. There's going to be a lot of confusion as to what the impact is and what it means. But again, I think we're creating a class system for education here, where you have those families who have the means to go and those who don't. And that is something that, you know, we can't get around. But
I think one of the worst cases, by the time we realize the damage that these voucher programs and charter schools are being done, there's not a public education infrastructure left to go back and repair the damage. So Baker Kurz, who used to be the superintendent in Little Rock, pointed out there's only so much dilution of a student population you can have and still have the economy of scale to put a quality school in place. So particularly middle and small towns in Arkansas, if they get a charter school taking students out of the system, they get a private school or two taking kids out of the system, there's homeschoolers are now going to be more encouraged to leave the system. That student population in the public school system is going to shrink and shrink and shrink. And none of those school systems, I mean, really we're talking about 3 different school systems now in Arkansas: the voucher system, the charter system, and the traditional public school. In small and medium-sized communities in Arkansas, none of the 3 of them are going to have enough resources to be healthy and do what's needed. But by the time we realize that, the damage is going to be done, and the time and effort and money it's going to take to repair that damage is going to be astronomical.
And then you're also looking at impacts of the communities, because our communities, they live and they thrive because of their neighborhood schools. And you're going to have neighborhood schools that are going to have to close, because superintendents have already said they are not going to be able to meet the demands of having the salaries for their educators. And there is also a clause in the bill that says that school districts can even apply for a waiver to not even meet that minimum starting salary if they're in a position of fiscal distress. And we know that many of our school districts are in fiscal distress, or they're headed that way. And this could actually increase fiscal distress across our state. And then we're going to have school districts or schools that are closing, which is then going to impact those communities that are around the schools, and it's going to have an impact also on the business community.
And I mean, there's also, you know, I mentioned earlier, this bill doesn't really do anything to address early childhood education. I think that, you know, if we're going to continue to see this crisis and not do anything about it, I think in 2 years' time we're going to see an exacerbation of this crisis, because the American Rescue Plan funds that a lot of child care centers and programs have been using to keep themselves afloat through the pandemic, all those funds will be gone. And I think it's going to be incredibly detrimental to our child care centers, our pre-K programs, and we are going to be looking at a situation where we are seeing program closures. We're going to be seeing early childhood educators continuing to leave the workforce in droves. I think overall early childhood education needs to be included when we have this conversation about this bill, because there simply is nothing really to help the system. And most children spend more hours in early childhood education, birth to pre-K, than they do in K through 8. So just the sheer number of hours that a child spends in early childhood education warrants them to be included in this conversation.
I have one more question. I know you were talking about fiscal distress based on raising the teacher's salary to $50,000, and someone maybe by listening to you might think that, oh, she's against raising the teacher pay. Can you kind of clarify that? Because I think that could maybe get lost in what you're trying to say.
We are 46th, or we're 48th or 49th, depending on which chart you use. So no, we completely support raising the salaries of our educators, and this would definitely put us within the top 5 nationwide, and it would also put us first in the southern region, because currently we are dead last. We are behind Mississippi with educator pay, and the educator pay should be addressed, but not just the certified teachers. We have to look at the pay of all of our educators. We need to look at the pay for our professional bus drivers, who are the first and the last individuals who see our children. We have to look at the pay for our nutritional workers. We need to look at the pay for our school nurses. We have to look at the pay for all of the educators, because it takes all of us together to provide these nurturing, supportive environments for our children that, you know, engage them and cause them to be inquisitive and, to do thought processing, so that they can become, be able to live and succeed in an interdependent and diverse world. So we certainly support the pay increase, but again, they're only looking at the base salary. Mm-hmm. The legislature is not looking at our veteran educators, nor are they looking at our educators who have gone back to school to further their education and to get advanced degrees. And so the salary needs to look at that. And again, the salary is just a minimum that school districts are required to meet. We have many school districts in the state who are already exceeding that $50,000, and they were exceeding the 36 to begin with. So now, if you are a school district that has always touted yourself as being the highest paid school district in the state, now you're going to have to raise it even more. And where are you going to find that funding, and what programs or other resources may be impacted in order to make that increase? Again, Not saying that we do not support that, because we truly support raising the pay of our educators. Educators should be paid a professional salary that is representative of their individualized training and specific licensure and education that they have had to be able to provide education for our children in our schools.
Yeah, I mean, and we have research that shows that improving teacher pay increases student achievement, and so we're definitely not sitting here saying that we shouldn't be raising our starting salary. Let's just be a little bit more thoughtful about all the things that she outlined, including the average salary for current educators. There's just simply no way to start the minimum at 50 and then, you know, call it a victory, because there's a lot more that goes into it.
And the other, I'm sorry.
No, please. No, please.
Okay, and the other thing with funding is that we've heard about the adequacy study, and that they're going to have the funding in the adequacy funding that's going to go out to the school districts. But remember, that funding is going to cover everything that the school district is going to be providing for that year, which is going to be salaries. It's going to be upkeep of the equipment and the facilities. It's also going to provide books, curriculum. It's going to provide the internet, the technology. All of that is included. Plus, it also includes your facilities for athletics, because we know that the communities, everyone wants to come out for the Friday night lights. And if you are looking at having changes and some of your funds are going and they're being diverted to a private entity, then that is taking funding away from our public schools, from our public resources, and then we're not providing increased one-to-one supports for our children who have special needs. We're not providing that increased intervention that we know that our children need, and it's also taking away the voice of the parents. This bill is supposed to be empowering the voice of the parents. But if you are limiting the parents' voice in being able to promote your child to a next grade, and you are going to have forced retention of a child, which we have research that shows that that has a negative impact on our children, then the parents are not empowered. The parents have had their voice taken away from them, particularly even when they go to, if they use the voucher and they go to another environment to provide what they think is going to meet the specific needs of their child, and then they get there and they find out that they do not provide those services, then again, the voice of the parent has not been included. And that is one of the issues that I believe we all feel is important, because this is supposed to empower parents, but it actually is taking away some of those parental empowerment pieces that they should have.
I want to add one more thing. And the first is that this is the most in-depth conversation this bill has had anywhere, and it's a press conference. It's crazy. I mean, that in itself is crazy. The state needs to slow down and have some in-depth policy conversations. All the public testimony was awesome, and I really appreciate everybody on any side that came out and spoke. But that was people testifying to their beliefs. It wasn't an in-depth back and forth conversation about the weeds of the policy. So first of all, the most in-depth conversation about policy that the bill has shouldn't happen at a press conference, as much as I appreciate all y'all. There's one other thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't just speak to before we ended. There's three core arguments that we hear from lawmakers against our position and critiques of the bill, and I want to share those three with you and tell you what I think of them. The first is that legislators say, look, we're funding this voucher stuff, but that doesn't mean that we don't support you, and we're going to fund what you want later. We agree the research says we should do pre-K and after school and summer programs and do what we need to do for our students with special needs. Well, here's the truth. They never do, because there's not enough money left over after they've squandered the money that could be spent on something proven on the vouchers. Pre-K hasn't had a funding increase in 10 years. The state has never invested a dime of state money in after-school and summer programs, even though there's research proving it's one of the most effective solutions. The state had the state had a task force on special education. What, 8 years ago, 7 years ago now? That showed massive unmet needs and made recommendations that the state hasn't funded any of. So this argument that it's not competition for dollars and we're going to do it all is just baloney. The second thing that they say is that this voucher program won't hurt public education, that we're still committed to public schools and that we're still going to fund adequacy. It's easy to say in year 1 and 2 and the costs are low, but you look at years 3, 4, and 5 as the cost of this program starts to reach $300 million, $400 million, $500 million. Where is that money going to come from? Are these legislators going to raise taxes to fund their voucher program and the traditional public school system? Or in the competition, again, as Linda Chesterfield said in the Senate, the pie is the pie. So in the competition for the pie, who's going to lose? And our experience has been as low-income kids in rural areas every single time. And so that's the concern about this bill's impact long-term on public education. And the last thing that I want to say that I just get real boiled about is that you're either for SB294 or you're for the status quo. I don't have a single member of our organization or a single partner that believes the status quo is sufficient. What we are arguing for is evidence-based reforms that will improve the status quo, that have been proven to do it in state after state, in place after place, in country after country. We can look at models. Again, this isn't rocket science. We know what to do. We are choosing bad policy. And so this is not either the status quo or Senate Bill 294. There is another way. And we just have to have the political will to go there. Sorry, I just had to share all that.
I think that's a great place to end.